Welcome tonight. We open a record most archives softened a chapter of American history that still smolders under new streets and polished plaques. Viewer discretion for historical violence in an educational context. If you care about how truth is filed, mislabeled, and quietly buried, stay with me, hear this out, share it, and add your voice so the ledger cannot close again. 1921. Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood. The district they called Black Wall Street hums with Saturday rituals, the barbershop's easy banter, the varnish-scented library tailors pressing suits for men who will never hire them, ushers raising the curtain at the dreamland. This prosperity is not an accident. It is thrift, braided with mutual aid. A church collection here, a veteran's pension there, a newspaper that teaches readers to believe in tomorrow. It looks ordinary because it's earned, but in a city mapped by Jim Crow arithmetic, such ordinary success is treated like an error to be corrected. Under the paint of normalcy sits tinder arranged by ordinance and habit, waiting for a rumor to become a match. Across town, language sharpens. Editors practice the word that will later matter, riot a syllable that can make insurance vanish and liability evaporate. Deputies learn how quickly a badge can multiply a mob. Veterans who fought for a different promise overseas are told to unsee the contradiction at home. When the spark arrives, a crowded courthouse, a young black man under accusation, a crowd rehearsing outrage, the choreography is ready. Disarm those who came to prevent a lynching. Arm those who came to finish one. Call the aftermath order. We will not show gore. We will show documents, maps, sworn statements, and Red Cross lists written after midnight. We will ask why a neighborhood that built itself by the rules was left unprotected by the rule of law, and how a single word locked thousands of claims in ash. If you're watching because someone once told you this was just a riot, keep watching. If you know it was a massacre, invite one more person to hear why the numbers still argue with the headlines. Before we go any further, tell us where you're listening from and whether your town keeps a story like this, still whispered, still waiting for its name. The road to that night was paved long before the first pane shattered. It begins with signatures and seals deeds that could be voided on a whim. Ordinances that drew invisible fences. Rail schedules that ran through black neighborhoods without stopping for black passengers. It begins with a language problem when newspapers decide which verbs belong to which bodies. When a city desk calls black prosperity, uppity commerce, and white fear concern, when police blotters treat rumor as source and a crowd as evidence. The ledger of hostility is full of entries that do not look like violence until the day they move in formation. From the courthouse to the newsroom, there is a habit of calling the unacceptable by administrative names. Segregation becomes custom, voter suppression becomes qualification, and the long theft of labor becomes market reality. In that vocabulary, Greenwood is a misprint proof that thrift and discipline could produce Banks cafes, a theater with a velvet curtain, and a newspaper that ran on optimism. For men whose authority rested on proving black incapacity, this was disturbing in a way they dared not confess, so they translated it into competition and then translated competition into threat. A threat invites policing. A threat justifies unspeakable measures that feel to the hand that wields them like maintenance of order. In the months before the fire, you can watch the lines harden. City leaders praise prosperity in oilfield editorials, then quietly deny paving petitions north of the tracks. Insurers sell policies in a tone of cheerful science, then bind them with a classified clause that only reveals its teeth after ash. Deputies are told that their badges extend the state's reach. They are not told that their deputations will extend a mob's confidence. Judges speak of the majesty of the law, then keep a docket that will, when it matters most, run out the clock. The result is an equilibrium with a fuse. Greenwood's success is tolerated as long as it remains symbolic. Photographed for a Sunday feature not tallied in year-end ledgers that show real capital. This is the arithmetic of Jim Crow: add prestige to the city, subtract rights from the people who built it. It is a system that dislikes surprises because surprises reveal design. When a white reader writes a letter to the editor warning of agitation, it is printed with gravity. When a black business owner warns of harassment, it is filed. The heat rises in whispers, a joke at a saloon about teaching them a lesson, a meeting where phrases like vigilance and citizen action are rehearsed until they sound like policy. Meanwhile, Greenwood continues Sunday hats and hymn books, ledgers, and late deliveries. Teachers grading papers under gaslight, unaware of the vote, already taken in rooms they will never enter. Pull the camera back further, and the pattern clarifies. After Reconstruction's promises were walked back, new instruments took their place: poll taxes, literacy tests, and court calendars that treated black plaintiffs as a scheduling error. The prison lease turned arrest into revenue. Sheriffs learned to measure quiet, and quiet meant deference. Newspapers, staffed by men who never crossed the tracks, wrote with the confidence of distance. In that climate, a single rumor could cascade because the structure behind it wanted a pretext. The pretext did not need to be proven. It only needed to be printable. Once in print, it could be policed. Once policed, it could be explained. And anything that can be explained can be forgiven by people eager to sleep. If you listen closely to the weeks before, there are final warnings, not mystical, but painfully ordinary. A minister reports strangers casing rooftops, measuring sightlines with their eyes. A hardware clerk notices bulk purchases of ammunition paid in cash and silence. A teacher hears boys too young to shave repeat men's talk about showing them who owns Tulsa. A veteran is told kindly and then less kindly to stop wearing his uniform through downtown. He hears the message order means your medals count only in photographs. On paper, these are anecdotes. In practice, they are omens. Some tellings reach for the supernatural whispers of a curse pronounced. When the district was surveyed of an old woman's dream in which roofs glow and the river runs backwards. Whether you believe in hexes or not, the city had a different kind of ritual. Convene the crowd with a headline, sanctify its purpose; with a rumor, absolve its acts; with a sheriff's nod. That is the American occult, where bureaucratic words do what candles and chalk circles once did, where a stamp that reads "banned" on a claim file can erase a family's proof more cleanly than fire. There is also the arithmetic of envy, which is less theatrical than hatred, but no less macabre in its outcomes. A black loan office that approves mortgages becomes a provocation to bankers who decline them. A theater marquee becomes an affront to men who cannot imagine black leisure without white permission. A newspaper editorial praising scholastic excellence becomes evidence that they are getting too confident. These are not crimes, they are mirrors. Yet a culture trained to confuse reflection with challenge starts to plan for a correction. A correction needs punctuation, a night a spark, a crowd that can tell itself it is responding rather than initiating. That punctuation is prepared in editorials that lean toward alarm, in speeches about protecting our women, in the quiet assurance that afterward, the word riot will do the paperwork. Police doctrine, too, enters the story policy written for emergencies reinterpreted as license. The badge grants the right to deputize. Deputization grants the illusion that the mob is now a task force. In the gap between statute and supervision, improvisation flourishes roadblocks that funnel fleeing families. Inventories taken from the wrong houses, a decision at dawn that detention is the quickest way to count survivors and the safest way to keep witnesses together and off the streets. The forms read cleanly. The reality bleeds at the edges. By the time the ink dries, the euphemisms are securely mounted: restored order, public safety curfew. None of this requires a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. It requires incentives. The insurer who denies a claim under a riot clause does not see himself as an arsonist. He sees himself as a professional. The editor who chooses a headline that inflames does not call himself a fire starter. He calls himself a realist. The judge who cites limitations and doctrine does not hear himself closing a grave. He hears himself safeguarding procedure. Each actor can tell a story that keeps his hands clean. Collectively, the story becomes gruesome, not because of gore, which we refuse to show, but because of the elegance with which paperwork can domesticate catastrophe. And still inside Greenwood, before the spark life insists, children memorize verses for Sunday. A pharmacist balances his books. A seamstress counts the day's seams and plans a new machine when the ledger allows. They are not naive. They are busy. In the city's official portraits, this busyness is called industry. In private mutters, it becomes getting above themselves. A society that writes dignity as insolence will eventually try to edit the people who embody it. When that editing happens, the margins will be filled with justifications, and the central text will be smoke. Call this the prelude written in invisible ink. It reveals itself when heat is applied. Heat from an elevator rumor, from a courthouse crowd, from the breathless confidence of men who know the law, will translate their acts into softer nouns by morning. The past weeks arrange the stage. The next night will drop the curtain. Before it does fix in your mind what was at stake, a neighborhood that believed in receipts and church minutes and mutual aid and school report cards, in contracts that looked the same in black hands as they did in white. That faith, ordinary, stubborn, decent, was the true offense. The system prepared its answer long before anyone shouted. The rest of the story is the sound that answer makes when it arrives. The first report cracks the evening like brittle glass. A phone call from the courthouse to a newsroom. A clerk's whisper swelling into a headline that outruns the facts. A crowd forms with the confidence of prior approval. Men in shirt sleeves and Sunday shoes, some with rifles they have not cleaned since the last hunt. Others with revolvers that smell faintly of oil and fear. The courthouse steps, polished by 1,000 ordinary mornings, fill with a choreography that looks spontaneous and is anything but speakers. Improvising speeches they have practiced for years, boys climbing statues for a better view. A rumor repeated so perfectly, it sounds like memory. The sheriff tries a gesture that will read well later. He orders people back, then looks away when the line hardens. In the distance, a smaller group advances. Black veterans, some still wearing the posture war stamped onto their spines, come to prevent a lynching the city pretends not to see. There is a sharp sound that witnesses later disagree about a misstep, a shove, an accidental discharge. A deliberate shot history does not give us a single angle. What it gives us is the effect. Panic translates into purpose for those who came for permission. Men who were merely brave, in their own estimation, become deputized brave within minutes. Armbands are issued. Badges are passed out as if they are bandages. The authority of the state is placed like a stamp on movements that already had momentum. The veterans who arrive to uphold order are instructed to surrender their weapons in the name of that same order. It is a neat inversion, and it works because the script has been rehearsed. Redefine the protectors as provocateurs, redefine the crowd as a committee. The language is clean. The streets begin to dirty. Greenwood hears the noise as weather turning. Shopkeepers who have learned to read the wind lower their shades. A pharmacist locks his cabinet and pockets a ledger, because in a city where words change value overnight, the only currency that might survive is written proof. Mothers summon children indoors with an urgency that needs no explanation. A pastor telephones other churches and speaks in code that no one taught him. Crises invent their own liturgies. On the tracks, men who have spent years stepping aside for trains are now stepping aside for caravans of cars heading north with lights off, guns in laps, and a kind of civic certainty glowing in their throats. At the first corner, a warning shot becomes a signal. Windows surrender their glass. A store's display of hats tumbles. Like a performed metaphor crowns, removed dignity, scattered merchandise repurposed into fuel for jokes that will not be funny tomorrow. There is taking as well as breaking. Items move from counters to pockets with an entitlement that later will swear it was seeking evidence. Someone kicks open a safe and finds only accounts receivable. Theft feels less satisfying when it has to learn bookkeeping. But the satisfaction returns when flame takes to drapery to paper, to the varnish that made the library smell like order. Fire is a simple language. It speaks in a way that editorials envy. Calls go out to police posts and guard armories. Help is requested and arrives wearing uniforms that to Greenwood's eye now look like a translation rather than a promise. The instruction spread by rumor fits inside official orders without friction. Roadblocks appear exactly where escape would have been simplest. Families trying to leave are told they must first be registered, identified documented safety as paperwork aid as a funnel. Men are separated from their homes as if the shortest route to peace is to remove witnesses from what peace requires. The phrase protecting property becomes elastic enough to cover taking control of entire blocks. And when fires bloom like punctuation marks at the end of blocks that used to be sentences about ambition, the authorities declare that a curfew is the fastest cure for chaos. Curfew is a word that makes cages sound temporary. The sky enters the story without asking permission. Some witnesses describe planes scouting. Others describe them as tools of intimidation. Still others swear to objects dropping jars, turpentine-soaked rags, the grammar of combustion. What the record certifies is less than what the night insists upon. The effect is just as survivors remember fear acquiring altitude, the sense that even rooftops, the last refuge of families who have learned exactly how narrow a stairwell can become, no longer belong to them. Those who argue the planes did not bomb must still contend with the people on the ground who felt bombed. History, meticulous as it means to be, sometimes has to carry both sentences in the same paragraph. By dawn, restoration of order becomes a logistical exercise. The National Guard assists with detentions. Police oversee relocations. Registration sites operate with the brisk pity of a disaster drill. Men line up and surrender anything that can be cataloged. Women carry infants and household documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds that were supposed to stand between them and arbitrary force. The lists grow, and with them the idea that what is happening has the blessing of process. The logic is persuasive. If we are writing it down, then it must be legal. If it is legal, then it must be right. Greenwood, reduced to names on a clipboard, learns how quickly a neighborhood becomes a roll call. Away from the lines, other records begin. A nurse at a makeshift clinic records injuries with the precision of someone who understands that accuracy is a form of memory. She writes through the night stops only to rinse her hands and underlines the time she hears someone say, as if reciting a policy that insurance will not honor claims in a riot. A telegraph operator at a hotel notes messages refused or delayed, then signs her name as if that signature might anchor the truth to something heavier than rumor. A pastor lists families he cannot find and leaves columns blank for the living to fill later. An attorney drafts a petition that reads like a map of loss, tallying addresses, estimating values, writing with a composure that sounds like disbelief that riot clauses must be examined for their intent. Each of these documents is an act of faith that paper can be the country that will not betray them. When the first claims are filed, the answer arrives with the cold confidence of precedent. The policies were written to exclude the very night they now describe. The law, tidy as a well-run desk, announces that fire can be an accident. But a riot is an event, and events are not covered. Men who paid their premiums monthly learn that the contract they thought was a shield is a mirror. It reflects their vulnerability back to them. A banker uses the word unfortunate without irony. An adjuster uses the word impossible as if it were a care. Meanwhile, the city considers replatting the redevelopment plan that promises safety by redesign. Safety in this context means different owners. In testimony taken weeks later, descriptions pile up that officials do not want to carry. A woman remembers being marched past the remains of a theater, the air still tasting of velvet turned to sour smoke. An elderly man describes a pile of papers blowing across a street that had once been a ledger of prophets and prayers. A boy recalls counting chimneys because there were no houses left to count. None of these are forensic in the way a museum prefers. All of them are precise in the way truth is when it has no other tool. The investigators write what they can, excise what they must, and publish with a tone that suggests closure when the only honest mood is incomplete. There are testimonies that never make it to paper. A midwife who saw a weapon she had no words for. A shop clerk who recognized the man who smashed his window because he had sold him nails the week before. A veteran who kept his honor rolled in a trunk that now smells of wet ash and refuses to open. These exist as sentences spoken over porches, as sighs prefacing stories told to grandchildren who will not learn their details in school. They are banned not by stamp, but by structure, the daily grind of disbelief that greets certain kinds of witnesses, the cultivated doubt applied to memories the city finds inconvenient. In the official narrative, numbers calm the panic. 35 blocks, it will say, because a number sounds like mastery. More than 1,000 homes, it will concede, because volume can be made abstract. Dead estimated at a range, given with an air of reluctant largesse. But the range is a wound. To the people who lived through it, the range does not feel like caution. It feels like refusal. If you cannot settle on account, how will you settle accounts? Arguments about whether the planes dropped fire obscure what cannot be contested. The ground was on fire and the people who needed help were cataloged instead. In church basements and borrowed classrooms, the survivors' committees meet. They attach affidavits to petitions. They hire lawyers who explain carefully how statutes of limitation compress grief on a schedule that grief does not recognize. They assemble photographs and albums that now start with emptiness. They draft a narrative that refuses to call the night a riot, because riot suggests equality of chaos. What they lived was imbalance made visible. Sometimes the meetings break into silence that lasts a long time, and then someone begins to read again. Names of businesses, names of streets, names of people whom the city would like to leave unnamed a little longer. Reading is how they practice jurisdiction over their own past. The city responds with a mixture of apology and impatience. It allows commemorations that do not assign culpability. It funds studies that confirm loss and recommend remedies that will need further study. It issues statements about resilience, a fine word when spoken by neighbors, a thinner one when spoken by a government that kept its receipts in order and let other people's burn. In newspapers, editorials weigh reconciliation against reparations, as if those are rival virtues. On anniversaries, dignitaries stand at podiums and acknowledge what previous dignitaries did not. Progress is measured in the grammar of speeches. Repair is measured on ledgers that remain mostly theoretical. Across these months, the most honest documents are the quiet ones. A Red Cross log noting the delivery of blankets to families who no longer own beds. A school register revised to mark children transferred, which in this case means displaced. A death certificate that lists cause in a line too small for truth. These records, unadorned, push against the official narrative like roots pressing up through concrete. They do not accuse, they persist. Persistence is its own indictment. There is a photograph that recurs and exhibits rows of men guarded waiting. The caption identifies them as detainees. The logic of the caption is not wrong. It is incomplete. The men are also witnesses, cued into muteness. Far off camera, a woman is counting spoons from a kitchen that no longer has a stove because counting is how she knows she has not been erased. A child told to be brave becomes what adults call brave by standing still. These are the images that an educational lens can show without trespassing on the sacred. They teach what happened while denying the spectacle any further lease. By the time the camp gates open, Greenwood's map has been redrawn as a hypothesis. Some families return to lots that have become holes. Some do not return at all. Rebuilding begins in the same key as before, quiet, practical, unafraid of the arithmetic. But the city's new math intervenes in places that used to be predictable. Permits, delayed valuations, depressed credit rationed. The miracle is that so much rises again. The tragedy is that what rises must now climb through mud poured there on purpose. People who once believed in the neutral promise of paperwork learn to read it like weather. A cloudless sky can still mean rain if the forms are unfavorable, and still testimony accumulates. A decade later, a scholar lunches with a survivor and writes down a memory that official reports could not digest. Half a century later, a television documentary airs and then disappears into licensing. A century later, a city authorizes ground-penetrating radar over a cemetery and calls in archaeologists who give the dirt a microphone. In each era, the truth returns with the patience of water, looking for the cracks in a foundation built to repel it. The most macabre feature of the story is not the fire is loud, and we have learned how to hear it. The most macabre feature is the elegance with which silence organizes itself, filling offices and courtrooms with a music that sounds like procedure. What remains are the records that refuse to be domesticated. The nurse's midnight notes, the pastor's list, the telegraph clerk's log, the attorney's petition framed like a family portrait. Together they rescue a shape of the night that official language tried to blur. They will never settle every argument. Some details are bartered to time. But they carry the weight that the word riot was designed to shed. They return agency to the people who tried to enforce law at a courthouse and were told by law to stand down. And they hand the next chapter its only honest starting point. Here is what was seen. Here is what was recorded. Here is what we still cannot count, without the cooperation of those who prefer not to remember. Dawn sketches the damage with an accountant's patience. Chimneys become tally marks. The ash has cooled to a soft gray that coats boot leather and the tongues of stray dogs. You can walk a full block without stepping on floorboards, because there are no floors, only foundations, like negative photographs. The dreamland is a silhouette of itself. The bank's vault door sits open like a mouth that slept through the alarm. Numbers begin to organize the grief. 35 block city clerks murmur as if the figure itself were an answer. More than 1,000 homes relief workers note because quantity is easier to publish than names. And for the dead, arrange low for the comfort of officials, high for the memory of survivors. To the living, the gap feels macabre. Not because of spectacle, we refuse spectacle, but because the arithmetic refuses to settle. If the count cannot be fixed, who will ever be accountable? At the fairgrounds, where order is said to be restored, a guard hands out tags, while a secretary sharpens pencils, as if efficiency were mercy. Families recite names so they can be checked against lists that did not exist yesterday. The process is practiced almost elegant. It dignifies itself by moving quickly. Yet speed here is not kindness. It is a way of guided forgetting. Write this sign here, stand there, and by the time you reach the front of the line, the old neighborhood will be a rumor you cannot prove without receipts that burned. On an adjacent table, a Red Cross nurse tallies blankets, bread, and splints. Her handwriting is the steadiest thing in the building. She is not trying to write history. She is trying to keep people alive. Still, history creeps into the margins, insurance likely void riot clause. She underlines it once hard enough to dent the paper on the next page. Across town, the ground has its own ledger. In alleys where wind rose ash like drifts of paper, men pull its safes with crowbars, not to steal, but to lift, to salvage the heaviness that proves a life once had weight. In a backyard, a child finds a porcelain doorknob that still remembers a hand's turn. On a street that no longer has an address, someone sets up a card table and tapes assigned to it missing. People come to list cousins and choir members and tenants, and the column headed "Seen After" remains too empty. No one writes gore. They write absences, the most gruesome line items in any archive. Investigators walk the perimeter, speaking the dialect of bureaucracy origin. Points probable causes proximate triggers. Their questions are properly shaped. Their clipboards are properly cross-ruled. When witnesses speak of planes, the investigators split the claim like a log reconnaissance or intimidation drops or no drops. The truth refuses to fit one notch. You can record that an object fell without proving what it was. You can notarize a fear without ratifying a theory. What will be printed later is cautious and careful, but the caution feels like distance to those who watched roofs glow from above and below. The aerial chapter will remain disputed in perpetuity. The terrestrial chapter is indisputable homes. Burned businesses, destroyed people detained under color of law. The city floats rectification under the gentlest names. Replatting, zoning improvements, fire breaks. The maps promising safety look like erasures to those who must live on them. Committees speak of orderly redevelopment as though the disorder had been weather instead of will. On a lectern, a rendering shows a boulevard where a bakery once stood. In small print, a timeline lists hearings not many Greenwood residents can attend because attendance requires a home address and a free afternoon. The language is soothing. The plan is surgical. Law firms begin their own work petitions, affidavits, polite fury in paragraphs. They argue that a label cannot change a fact. Call it a riot and fire still burned according to arson's logic, with intent, with accomplice, with result. Insurers answer in sentences that sound like stone exclusions, precedents, acts of civil commotion. If you listen closely, you can hear the policy writers shrug 1,000 miles away in a different decade. The clause was drafted long before Greenwood rose, and now it falls like weather that always knew what season it preferred. The banned truth here is not hidden in a basement. It is printed on page 3 of a contract nobody thought to fear. When the first funerals proceed, they are quiet in a way that refuses romance. No violent detail is shown. A brass band does not play because instruments were lost. Pastors borrow pulpits from churches that still stand. Mourners borrow chairs from neighbors who still have them. A city that proclaims restored calm cannot spare a police escort. The route to the cemetery bends around detours where inspection teams puzzle over char patterns. In the plots themselves, the earth is packed with a haste that will be debated a century later. Records note interments. Some names align with bodies, some do not. Long after ceremonies and speeches lose their cadence, shovels will return to the same ground, supervised by archaeologists and watched by descendants who have learned to measure progress by the precision of a trowel. Why was this story kept banned? Not always by seal, often by habit. Start with economics. Greenwood's capital was an argument that required an answer. If black enterprise could scale, then a prevailing social theory could not. Burning answered what debate could not resolve. Naming it a riot finalized the transaction loss without liability, fire without an arsonist. Add politics. Bosses and boards prize calm. Acknowledging state complicity or negligence threatens budgets and reputations. The path of least resistance has a legislative smell order, restored lessons learned moving forward. Then law. Statutes measure harm by calendars and categories. If you can make the calendar run out and the category fit the exclusion redress, becomes a philosophical exercise. Nothing to see here, says the file, and the file is what courts see. Erasure requires mechanisms. They arrive neatly dressed. Disarm the people needing protection, arm the people promising to provide it. Define detention as humanitarian, to cover how witnesses are managed. Frame rebuilding as modernization to rationalize new owners. Install doubt in the details, most likely to stick in memory planes, numbers intent so the whole can be dismissed as controversy. Invoke resilience so mourning can be truncated and restitution postponed. The miracle of the 20th century is not that Greenwood was destroyed. Human beings have always been able to break what they envy. The miracle that Dark One history prefers not to call a miracle is the administrative finesse with which destruction was tamed into minutes and memos. Even so, the record sprouts through concrete. A receipt for lumber bought to rebuild where officials wanted a boulevard. A photograph of a wedding staged in a church basement whose sanctuary is still a skeleton. A school roster written in a hand that will not allow the word transient next to a child who had an address last week. These are not heroic artifacts. They are stubborn ones. They insist the neighborhood existed, that its ledger is more than a morality tale. They convict softly, like good light in a room where the dust can finally be seen. There is a temptation as the century turns and ceremonies multiply to declare the lesson complete. Plaques appear. Curricula expand. Dignitaries say massacre out loud. Necessary steps all. But the old mechanisms remain available wherever fear, profit, and procedure can be braided. That is the aftertaste, the way a story can conclude in public and continue in practice. The educational task is not to audition outrage. It is to map the system. When you can point from a burning storefront to a clause in a policy from a shouted rumor, to a city ordinance from a deputized armband, to a courtroom phrase that empties pockets cleanly, you make repetition harder. So here is the gruesome revelation. We allow ourselves to speak. The spectacle of fire was not the most terrible part. The most terrible part was the tidiness that followed the paper path so well swept that future readers might believe nothing happenstance could be so orderly. And here is the counter-revelation order can be made to serve truth too. In the past few years, the ground has been searched with science. Reports have been written with fewer evasions. Names have been recovered. Procedure redirected can become remembrance. What still haunts Tulsa is not only what happened, but how easily a city learned to live as if a neighborhood's ledger could be closed without balancing. Until the balance is shown, the smoke belongs to everyone. The city carries on as if daylight were a cure. But the ledger of what happened keeps writing itself in margins, budgets, zoning maps, museum captions, family photographs that travel from mantle to classroom screens. A century sounds like distance until you touch it. In Greenwood, you can buy coffee on a corner where an elder remembers counting chimneys because there were no houses left to count. You can hear a student recite an address that no longer exists with the assurance of someone claiming a birthright that a map forgot. The past does not ask permission to be present. It lives in valuations that never recovered, in family trees with branches struck through and small loans made to a grandson, because a bank said no to a grandfather when leverage would have multiplied hope. Loss compounds as reliably as interest. Repair, when it is attempted, moves to a slower meter. Yet the district breathes. It insists that the story not be closed like a case file, but kept open, tended like an archive that will not be pruned for comfort. There is wisdom in the ordinary that the spectacle never taught. A grocer who remembers the year's stock ran thin teaches his daughter the discipline of inventory. Not only for shelves, but for rights. Count what you have, note what is missing, trace the pipeline that delivers or denies. A choir director rehearses on weeknights in a sanctuary rebuilt twice, instructing teenagers to listen for rests as carefully as for notes. Silence has information too. A barbershop keeps a clipping from a newspaper that once refused to print certain names. The page has yellowed, but the ink still carries the arrogance of its day. Customers read it between fades and lineups, laughing softly at the tone, and then falling quiet in the places where the tone did its damage. Survival here is an ethic made of maintenance. Keep the receipts, share the story correct. The caption, bring a chair to the meeting, where chairs have a way of running out. You can chart the afterlife of the fire in infrastructure. Highways curve with an engineer's neutrality and discover decades later that they have a psychology. An exit ramp draws prosperity one way and disperses it the other. A redevelopment zone promises safety and arrives with price points that exile the people whose names once made the street signs. Every city writes its values into concrete: who should arrive with ease, who should linger with leisure, who should pass through quickly, eyes forward. In Tulsa, the distance between what was and what is remains measurable: a few minutes by car, a generation by policy. This is the part that feels least cinematic and most decisive. The threat today rarely announces itself with matches. It speaks in petitions, pro formas, and glossy renderings that brighten land by dimming memory. The counter is unglamorous, but potent meetings that run long ballots, marked with clarity audits that track who benefits from public projects and classrooms, where students can point to a map and explain when a line meant to protect became a line meant to exclude. The law trails the harm the way light trails a star. Statutes that could not imagine a century of delayed discovery tell plaintiffs that time has expired. Courts invoke procedure as if it were immoral. Legislatures debate whether to name the crime with a noun that unlocks remedies or a euphemism that keeps the ledger polite. In the meantime, families bury elders whose testimonies could have powered a different verdict. The temptation in those losses is resignation. Accept that some debts will never be paid, that recognition is the best you can ask, from an era that prefers commemoration to compensation. Greenwood does not concede that point. Its citizens practice a longer patience. They press for renaming that is not cosmetic memorials that fund scholarships with timelines measured in decades, business grants that acknowledge capital annihilated rather than merely delayed. They publish reading lists, not to outsource justice to literature, but to ensure that future clerks and council members can recognize the architecture of harm before it completes itself. Education becomes a civic technology. Fourth graders handle facsimiles of Red Cross cards and learn what census categories conceal. High schoolers read editorials from 1921 aloud and underline verbs that turned rumor into policy. College students map insurance exclusions against burn patterns and see how language can be an accelerant. The goal is not to rehearse outrage indefinitely, but to train recognition so that when another city uses blight to mean people, we prefer not to finance. Someone can lay the documents side by side and say, without theatrics, that we have seen this before. The most radical sentence in a teacher's mouth may be the simplest: show your work. It is how we rescue truth from posture and keep it available to those who will need it when the calendar tries to make harm look old enough to ignore. Commemoration evolves too. A century ago, eulogies were written against a headwind that tried to blow the candles out. Today, ceremonies more often light from within names pronounced correctly. Biographies sketched in brief, a brass quartet, playing a hymn whose chords were carried through the worst night because someone refused to let music be another thing stolen. But commemoration without allocation is a gentle betrayal. The families know this. The city is learning. Plaques should be expensive not in bronze, but in budget. The line item that matters is the one that changes a child's odds in a neighborhood that still bears the shadow of a previous century's debits. Accountability is not a mood. It is a spreadsheet that can stand inspection. For those who ask what justice would look like if it finally arrived, the answer is not a single check or proclamation. Though both may be parts of the sum, justice would look like predictable capital at fair rates in places once starved of it. It would look like schools that do not require heroic fundraising for baseline excellence. It would look like legal aid on retainer, the way some neighborhoods keep private security routine unashamed. It would look like zoning that protects memory at the same altitude as it protects property values, and like transit that connects opportunity rather than diverting around it. It would look like courts that admit history into the room, not as a guest speaker, but as a rule of evidence. None of this glows on the horizon. It advances in steps so incremental they resist montage. But step after step becomes a route, and a route once walked, often enough becomes a right. If you are listening from afar, you may be tempted to treat Greenwood as a singular tragedy whose lesson is to be sad. The lesson is to be specific. Ask what was taken, who took it, who was paid, who was not, and which instruments are still on the table for the next taking. Ask which words in your town perform the same magic riot once did, turning victims into liabilities and liabilities into nobody's problem. Ask which maps carry a residue of intention disguised as convenience. Then ask what capacity your community has already built mutual aid funds that can be formalized into revolving credit. Story circles that can be formalized into public comment with quorum. Youth programs that can be formalized into local internships that do more than decorate a grant application. Memory that does not grow mechanisms is sentiment. Greenwood's insistence is to grow mechanisms that remember. The families, meanwhile, keep the key customs. They gather with the precision of liturgy names, red spaces left children introduced to elders with a phrase that keeps lineage intact. This is who you come from. Sometimes the gathering happens at a graveside, where science has returned a soldier to his people. Sometimes it happens in a storefront where a business plan is read aloud, like a psalm of future tense. They pray in voices shaped by experience and aspiration, not because piety is a substitute for policy, but because hope needs oxygen. After the final amen, they do what they have always done: count chairs, wash dishes, exchange numbers, plan the next meeting. Justice, if it arrives, should find them mid-preparation. We end not with closure, because closure belongs to stories that obey the tidy arc of fiction. We end with an accounting a city that has begun to balance what it once hid, a district that refuses to be reduced to ruin or resilience alone, a nation slowly learning that an apology is not a receipt. If this hour has given you clarity, use it. Share the record. Teach the mechanism. Support the institutions, archives, clinics, bookstores, classrooms that hold the line against choreographed forgetting. And leave with a question sized for the long work ahead. When the next ledger presents itself with polite headings and plausible footnotes, will we read past the euphemisms in time, or will we let another neighborhood learn? Again, how easily a city can name fire as order and call the aftermath peace.